Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. Michael Conklin, the Powell Endowed Professor of Business Law at Angelo State University, begins our 4-episode series on slavery reparations. Professor Conklin talks today about his research on reparations and rhetoric. We spoke on April 22nd, 2021.
All right, well, I'm Dr. Michael Conklin. I'm the Powell Endowed Professor of Business Law at Angelo State University. My research efforts have a very wide reach, but I have published some on policing and reparations recently.
Excellent, thank you. And we'll be discussing your the article, and I'll link it in the notes. The uphill battle for reparations, reparationists, a quantitative analysis of the effectiveness of slavery reparations rhetoric. So if you could kind of start with the definition that you came to and why you were looking at and how you were looking at this.
Yeah. So this is a big question. A lot of people have a lot of different things in mind when they talk about reparations. There was a politician who said that by legalizing marijuana, well, that's reparations because people could open marijuana dispensaries and make money that way. That seems to be quite a stretch, but kind of the narrow definition, and of course, we're pretty much going to be focusing on slavery reparations because there's other types of reparations that we have done in America. So with slavery reparations, I define it pretty narrowly, which is some type of cash payment. And that could also be like a tax benefit too. If you're paying less taxes, that's similar to getting a cash payment. So some type of a cash payment. And here it gets kind of cloudy, but to either right the wrongs or to compensate for some past injustice. So it is kind of a slippery, kind of vague concept, and that's part of the problem when you're asking people, do you support it or not? But that's the kind of the generally understood definition.
Right, and then there's this differentiation between also we'll get to that, the people who would get it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So how did you design the survey that you did?
Well, I was curious, there was some hearings about the issue of reparations, and people, if you've seen these hearings on TV, I always find them kind of insulting because people will show up and they'll pretend to listen to the people, but then after they're done, they'll have like a statement, and they'll just read the statement as if they considered what the people said. It's like, well, you had that typed up and written, you knew what you were going to say. You didn't really listen to those people in front of you. But in any event, these people came with various backgrounds. Some were for and some were against slavery reparations, and they gave their arguments. And there were various different arguments about the benefits and the downsides of a slavery reparations program. So I was curious, well, these politicians there weren't really listening, but I was curious, what would be effective? I also teach a class on persuasion and negotiations and kind of how to use certain rhetorical, not tricks, but, tactics to get your point across and to persuade people. So I was curious, well, what would be more effective? And we have ways of measuring that, just a simple survey. So I created a survey, and I only used 4 different prompts. So if you took this survey, you only got one of the 4. You don't get all 4. So the 4 different prompts were precedent, empathy, a white person emphasizing harm, and an African-American person emphasizing harm. So the precedent argument went like this. It said, I support reparations for African Americans in the form of a cash payment by the government. There is historical precedent in America for compensating victims of governmental discrimination. For example, Japanese Americans who were incarcerated in internment camps during World War II received reparations from the US government in the form of a cash payment in 1988. So then it's kind of, well, based on that, now are you in favor of reparations? And people got to say whether they were or not. The empathy prompt that some people got said, I support reparations for African Americans in the form of a cash payment by the government because the lasting effects of slavery. Imagine if you and your family were the victims of appalling and intentional governmental discrimination. Wouldn't you want to be compensated for the harm you suffered? Okay, so it's very, the first one was kind of analytical. The second one was kind of more emotional. And then the second and third one, it just changes who's making the argument. And the first one, it says, the person speaking says, as a white person, I recognize that white people have caused a lot of suffering to African Americans through the lasting effects of slavery. African Americans should receive reparations in the form of a cash payment by the government to compensate them for the harm that white people have caused them. And then the fourth and final one, it's those exact same words, but it's just the person speaking says, as an African American, I think that we should receive the reparations. So those were the four different prompts that I measured for their effectiveness.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then the results you found were, I guess, surprising in some regard and not surprising in others. Could you first speak kind of the general, what you found, and then kind of break it down to liberal versus conservative?
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah. So I asked people at the beginning of the survey, how likely are you to support reparations? And then after they read the prompt, I asked them again, now how likely are you to support reparations? So measuring success by the biggest increase in support before and after, it was really close between the precedent and the empathy one gained the most support. And then the two, the white or the African American person emphasizing harm did considerably worse than those other two. And yeah, you got very different responses when you broke it down between liberal and conservative. With conservatives, the white person emphasizing harm did horribly, which was somewhat of a surprise because I thought it would do better because people are generally more likely to accept the positions of other people who are more like them. That guy's just like me and he came to that conclusion. Oh, maybe I should too. And not surprisingly, the people who did this survey who marked more conservative were disproportionately more white. So it was kind of surprising. And I wonder if that's maybe because they viewed it as kind of, it's kind of a strong way to put it, but maybe subconsciously it was kind of like they were kind of like turning their back on their own race by supporting this thing to give money to people of another race. That's one potential explanation there. So yeah, it's interesting. So that goes to show, if you were an activist who was out trying to convince people of things, whether it was this or some other policy, you really have to tailor your message. So for some people, maybe you emphasize one thing, for other people, you emphasize something else. In negotiation and persuasion, we always tell people there's no one like magic script that you can read for everybody. You always have to tailor your message. That goes if you're trying to sell a used car on Craigslist, whether you're trying to sell politicians on a policy or your neighbor on who they should vote for. You always tailor your message to that individual person.
Yeah, and then one of the most surprising things that I read in the article was this kind of the African American response to the survey and how African Americans will withdraw support and what causes them to withdraw support for reparations versus stay within their, gain support for it, I guess.
Yeah, that's really interesting, almost counterintuitive. So before I get to that, let's talk about kind of the bigger picture. And this comes up a lot when you see something on the news or a newspaper and they'll cite a study and it'll say, 80% of people surveyed support, reducing government spending. That's kind of a classic example. You think, well, gosh, everybody wants to reduce government spending. Why don't we ever get that? Government spending always goes up every year. And the reason is because it's easy to get people to agree to support some generic policy. reduce government spending. That's easy. But when you go in and you kind of get into the nitty gritty and say, okay, you all want to reduce government spending. Let's see. You want to cut this? Oh, no. Well, you want to cut this? No. You want to cut this? No. Well, hold on. I mean, what do we want to reduce this or not? So it's the same thing with reparations, right? If you just ask people kind of, are you in favor of reparations? People have different things in mind. So they're thinking what their idea of it is, and they say, yeah, I support that. So you get, different surveys come up with different numbers. I mean, some of the more high ones, I think it's around 40% or so. So you may look at that and think, wow, 40%, and it's increasing. It used to be lower. Now we're 40%. That's really good. So if we just got a little more, we could get just past 50 and then we'd have it. Well, no, because those are just people saying, yeah, I want reparations. Okay, but when you take all those people who want reparations, when you actually get down into, okay, how are we going to actually do it? Who's going to get the money? Where's the money going to come from? How much money? What are they going to have to prove to show to get the money? What are the potential negative side effects? All this stuff. When you actually start getting to that, then all of a sudden this maybe 55% of people all of a sudden get segmented out, and 15% people want this plan and 20% people want this plan, and all of a sudden you've lost your overwhelming support. So this kind of illustrates this question that you asked me. So yeah, not in my work, but in previous research, they asked people, do you support reparations for all African Americans who can prove they have like some kind of documentation and they can prove they were descendants of slaves? And then a separate question, do you support reparations for all U.S. citizen African Americans? Okay, for all non-Black races, Hispanics, Asians, whites, those two questions were pretty much the same. They got about the same amount of support. With African Americans, there was greater support for giving it to everybody, and there was less support for giving it to just those who can prove that they are documented ancestor of slaves, which you think would be the opposite, because surely they're the people who should definitely get the money. And then, well, maybe less people would support just for everybody across the board. It's kind of the other way around. So the logical explanation is it's kind of, a lot of people would realize, well, I don't have documentation. That's going to be hard. So I don't want that. And so now it's clear that this is not saying that people would prefer one over the other. This is saying that people would prefer no reparations among the African American community. They would prefer no reparations at all if it would only go to people who could prove that they had the documents that they were ancestors of slavery, but they would support it if it would just go universally to them all. So it does kind of go to show that principle, yeah, you can show support, but once you start getting into the nitty gritty of how we're going to do this, people start, and if they had maybe, debates or something like that and discussions, it could get kind of nasty of like who's getting it and who's not. Well, if you're going to get it, then I'm not even going to support it at all. We shouldn't have it at all. So that's kind of the real world application of trying to get, policies passed. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, that's such and then you get into the, then even the legal, I also found the legal problems incredibly fascinating, because I didn't know about these court cases. I mean, I've been reading about reparations in preparation, and this is the first I came across them. Would you be comfortable talking about those?
Yeah, a little bit, not too in depth, but yeah, there'd be issues that would come up. There would absolutely be litigation there, and it's not clear, especially with our current, makeup of our current Supreme Court. It's not clear how that would come out. So taking, for example, the reparations that we paid out in 1988 to the people and the survivors of the people from the Japanese American internment camps that we did in America during World War II. So that went specifically to those people. We knew the people, we identified them, we paid specifically to them, or if they were dead, specifically to their ancestors. So everybody agreed that was allowed. But with reparations, with slavery reparations, it's not as clear. You're kind of, I mean, you're kind of using race as a proxy, which is not necessarily bad. I mean, it's a close proxy, but not 100% of African Americans are descendants of slaves. Um, some may have come from somewhere else. Technically, some of them may have had ancestors who were themselves involved in the slave trade. So you're kind of using race as a proxy and giving people money based on that. And furthermore, we're removed obviously from legalized slavery in America. So that would be an issue that it's so far removed. Now, of course, the other side would come back and say, well, yes, we're removed from the act of the legalization of slavery, but even today, the remnants of slavery are still here. We still see those. And for that reason, it's still like it's kind of the harm kind of hasn't gone away. And it also goes to this definition of reparations. I mean, how some people would say that the Japanese American payments weren't technically reparations because it would be more like, if you destroyed my car, I would sue you and I would make you pay to fix my car. Well, technically, I mean, you're compensating me for a wrong in the past that you did, but it's not reparations. I'm just getting compensation for what you did. So it gets kind of tricky with the definition and kind of defining it there. So yeah, it would not only have the hurdle of getting public approval and getting politicians to then agree not only that it's a good idea to do reparations, but specifically we all agree that this is the version of it that we're going to do, which is very, very difficult, for politicians to do. And then they'd also have the problem of passing it in a way that would get past the legal hurdles. I'm actually, I've set it aside, but I just recently finished the book. I believe the book is called The Whiteness of Wealth, which has to do with how our current tax code is set up in a way. It treats races equally in a sense. The IRS doesn't even get racial information when you fill out your taxes, but in another way, there's ways that the tax code is structured so that on average, the people who get tax benefits kind of their finances and their family structure is kind of looks more like an average white household. And when you look at the average Black household, it looks more like the type that doesn't get tax incentives. So, it's kind of an argument of, it's not literally a racist system or set up in a discriminatory way, but it kind of has that effect. And I brought that up because her solution in the book was she recognized, well, we can't just say, African Americans pay less taxes. That would never pass. The Supreme Court would never go for that. But we could say something as far as like, well, if you're under this amount, we're going to give you a break. So no matter what race you are, if you're under this amount, you get a break. And then that would fall disproportionately to Black and brown people. And there's issues with that too, though, because you're kind of using, some people warn that it's harmful to use disadvantage and poverty as a proxy for being Black. I mean, that's kind of insulting if you think of it. So is that kind of the kind of stereotype that we want to perpetuate? I mean, the statistics, yes, statistically, there's more African Americans in poverty than white people. That's a statistical fact. But is that kind of a stereotype that we want to perpetuate? So there's issues with that as well. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that was one of the things that comes up with in what I've been reading about reparations too, in that like not only are you repaying us for the harms done in slavery, but also Jim Crow, and where African Americans were not allowed to own property, or wealth wasn't generated in the same generational way as white people. Yeah. And other. So I mean, it's interesting you brought that up because it's come up. Are we talking just slavery, or are we talking like the fact that the system has been kind of geared to disenfranchise so much of that?
Yeah. And yeah, that affects a lot of things. When I went to college, my dad had gone to college, and his dad had gone to college. So he kind of gave me advice. I didn't really listen to it too well, but he was able to give me advice about college. And as I was young and growing up, he emphasized the importance, get your application done and, get this done. So, if my parents hadn't gone to college, uh, maybe I wouldn't have gone, or they wouldn't have emphasized that. So yeah, those things do kind of have a lasting effects. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and this survey can also be kind of adapted to the defund the police movement, which is a whole other topic for another day. But some of these tactics of like, defining a term, which should, seems to be controversial, but at the same time is way more involved than just the. So I really enjoyed the paper, and I thought that it brought up some really great issues. Have you had much? I was going to say one other thing about the.
Well, while you're looking at that, I was going to say, we're talking about kind of unintended consequences.
Yes.
So some people warn, and even some African Americans say, I don't really want reparations, because if we do that, yeah, it'd be nice, I get a little one-time payment, but then it's kind of like, now I'm bought and sold, and now it's kind of like anytime in the future the issue of race legitimately comes up, people are just going to say, oh, no, stop, I'm not, don't even bring it up, I'm not going to listen to you, we paid you off for that, that's been done, we made the payment, it's done, I'm refusing to discuss that issue anymore in the future. So in that sense, to some people, they think it could even do more harm than good. Like it'd be like a kind of a buying off of guilt, which could potentially do more harm than good.
Yeah, that's I'm interviewing a gentleman next week who wrote a paper basically arguing all the reasons why reparations shouldn't be. So we'll see how he's basically saying everything that you were bringing up, and that like Black people were involved in the slave trade, that it's insulting to be equate poverty with race and just all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating to me. But it's also funny because in our discussions, I've seen the kind of the protesting should be allowed, but it's affecting ratings, so they shouldn't do it. So it was the same person who was saying like, well, yeah, they should be allowed to protest, but it's also making people stop watching. Well, then they shouldn't do it. So it was, my head's kind of.
Never thought of that.
Okay.
Yeah, it was interesting how quickly the circle kind of forms sometimes, where you get into that the nitty gritty of it. Like, oh, if they're going to lose revenue, then they shouldn't do it because they have to get paid, and it's that stuff. So. So that's great. Are you? I think there's a lot more we could talk about, but this is probably a good place to leave the paper. Are you working on something with wealth at this point?
I wrote just a review. I get advanced copies of books, so I received that book. Yeah, it is called The Whiteness of Wealth. I know the author's last name is Brown. I forget her first name. She's a tax attorney. It's interesting. Makes some interesting points. I recently finished a paper on how media accounts, this kind of goes with the use of rhetoric. You'll hear the term officer-involved shooting. Okay, so and it's generally used when an officer shoots somebody else. But if you think of the term, I mean, that's a very favorable term. Officer-involved shooting. Well, was he shot? Was he the one shot? Like it doesn't. You don't even know. So it'd be much more accurate to say, on this night, officer shot suspect so and so, and that's neutral. That's not stacking the deck in favor of anybody. Sometimes officers do legitimately need to shoot people, but yeah, officer involved shooting is. So I had a survey where I kind of asked people, you read the following headline, and one headline was like, officer shoots person at this night, and the other one was, at this night there was an officer involved shooting. And it was like, just based on that, what's your initial impression as to how not legitimate, but how justified that officer shooting was based just on that headline. And of course, the people who read the officer involved shooting were much more likely to say, well, that was probably a justified shooting, even though it's describing the exact same event. So there's ways to kind of use terms to describe the exact same thing, but get people to come to very, very difficult conclusions. I mean, you see this in all aspects of life, how we define different terms, pro-life, pro-choice, pro-Second Amendment, pro-common sense gun legislation. You don't generally want to be anti something. So there's ways to kind of favorably, and there's, you want to be the one to kind of race to define the terms at the beginning. So you're not the one who's kind of, my favorite is the living wage. How, who can come out against the living wage? It's like you're coming out in favor of killing people. So yeah, if you can be the first to kind of define, so now your opponent is living wage and you're not anti-living, anti-living wage. So yeah, kind of getting out there first and defining those terms. I think people who were, I think personally that the defund the police term is not a good term. I mean, it's kind of scary. I think they should focus instead of, okay, so we're going to defund this, or we're going to put the money to, focus on that, like the community policing or the healthcare aspects or whatever else, jobs training or whatever, focus on that part. If you just say defund the police, that's
Well,
kind of more of a.
It reminded me what I wanted to bring up, which is the idea that the reparations has been a radical idea, and therefore it's been brought up by people who are seen as agitators or radicals.
Yeah.
So if it's put in other people are the messenger, then it has a different. So could you speak a little bit about that? Yeah.
So like people like who are controversial figures, whether you personally agree with them or not. So people like Louis Farrakhan, Jesse Jackson, I forget some of the others, but they're controversial figures. So they've come out strongly in favor of reparations, and I think a strong case could be made that could be doing more harm than good. Your opponents can kind of use that against you, be like, oh, well, you don't want to be like these extremists, do you? What, do you like these people? People on both sides will do that. So it's kind of interesting. I think without giving specific examples, each side on the right or left, they have kind of a person on the other side who's kind of the most extreme example. And boy, like they're their favorite politician. They will always point to that extreme person, even though they're not really representative of the party at large. And it's kind of like, they're kind of painting it with a bad picture. I mean, there's examples in politics where people, it makes them happy that there's somebody on the other side who's saying something really extreme. So then you can paint everybody on that side with a broad brush. Well, you don't want to be like that one extreme person, so don't support that program. But if you look logically at the program, maybe it's a good program. Just because somebody extreme supports it, I mean, Louis Farrakhan, Jesse Jackson, they support all kinds of reasonable things, so just because you can point to one extreme person who supports a policy doesn't make it a bad policy. But that's kind of a tactic people can use, and it kind of creates this like self-perpetuating kind of cycle, because the most extreme people kind of come out in favor of it. So then people say, ooh, well, if that's who's supporting it, I guess I shouldn't support it, which then causes only extreme, because those are the reasonable people. Well, not really, those are kind of the average people who will say, well, I'm not going to support something extreme. Those are the moderate people. So then you only get extreme. So then it perpetuates, you're only getting extreme people, which then causes only extreme people, and it just kind of goes and goes and goes. So it's kind of coming more into the mainstream, the reparations issue, because during the 2016 primary, what am I getting mixed up? The 2020 primary, there was I think a majority of the 16 or 18 or so Democrats who were running for the primary who said, at least in some way, that they would support reparations. So it is definitely getting more mainstream.
Thanks for listening to Unpacking 1619. For more information on Heights Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit heightslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.